Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. Today's topic is Marxist theory. During the latter half of the 19th century, German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed a comprehensive set of philosophical and political ideas that have had an enormous impact on social, political, and economic theory, as well as on social and political movements. Marxist theory remains relevant today because it has continued to evolve through the decades and has been deeply integrated into a wide range of theories and practices. Now, Marxist theory definitely qualifies as a post-humanist framework, so let's quickly review a few terms from previous videos to make sure that we all understand what that means. Let's start with the concept of agency. Agency means the capacity for action or the power to change the conditions of one's existence or to shape one's own destiny. The concept of agency was a central component of the history of humanism, which had its roots in classic Greek and Roman society, and then, after a long period of anti-humanist thinking in the medieval period, became the predominant worldview, at least within Western civilization, during the Renaissance period, the Enlightenment period, the Romantic period, and the Victorian period. Humanism is the idea that human beings, individually and collectively, have agency and should have the freedom to exercise it. It's an optimistic view of human progress achieved by unleashing the full potential of human agency. In other words, it's the idea that we can build better societies and better lives by giving people the freedom and resources to explore the world around them and act upon it. During the Victorian period of the late 19th century, however, we started to see the emergence of post-humanist ideas that challenged many of the basic assumptions of humanism. Post-humanism is not exactly against humanism. It's better to think of it as after or beyond humanism. Now, there's no standard definition of post-humanism, but the one we've been using is any philosophy or worldview that recognizes that human agency is limited by the fact that the human self is structured through its experiences within the social environments that it inhabits. Okay, so as previously mentioned, Karl Marx was a German philosopher in the 19th century, and his lifelong collaborator was fellow German philosopher Friedrich Engels. They wrote many works together, including the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and Marx wrote many works individually as well, including, most famously, Das Kapital, or Capital, the first volume of which was published in 1867. In its original form, Marxist theory contains three main elements that we're going to discuss. The first is a theory of subject formation through material relations, and we'll talk about what subject formation means. The second is a critique of capitalism as an exploitive system. And the third is historical materialism, which is Marx's theory of historical development through various stages leading towards a socialist revolution. Now, before we get into these three components of Marxist theory, I want to clarify a few things about what socialism means and distinguish it from communism. So, socialism really just means shared ownership of resources, as opposed to private ownership, and it can take many different forms. In fact, we have a lot of forms of shared ownership even in our mostly capitalist society that stresses private ownership. For instance, when you pay taxes, you're essentially buying into a system of shared ownership of public resources like roads, sewage systems, electrical grids, irrigation and water treatment systems, public schools, public parks, public transportation systems, criminal justice systems, fire departments, and so on. In short, all of the public infrastructure that our capitalist economy sits on top of and cannot exist without. For instance, many of us privately own vehicles like cars and motorcycles, but imagine if you could only drive your privately owned vehicle on roads that you privately financed and owned. That wouldn't work out too well, and there wouldn't be much of a capitalist market for cars. In other words, capitalist markets can't actually exist without a socialist infrastructure. So, socialism is actually all around us, and the only real debates are how much of it we should have, how it should be managed, and how it should operate in relation to our capitalist forms of private ownership and exchange. Of course, Marx imagined a socialist society in which shared ownership would be pretty much all-inclusive. But even if we don't support such an expansive view of socialism, we can still find a lot of value in Marx's socialist theory. Now, the history of the word communism is complicated. When Marx and Engels were writing in the 19th century, it was really just a synonym for socialism. So their famous book, The Communist Manifesto, is really just a socialist manifesto. But during the 20th century, the word communism came to be associated with political regimes in which socialist forms of ownership are managed by a single political party that exercises power in ways that are undemocratic and authoritarian. So, in the US, for instance, we have quite a bit of socialism, but we don't have any communism. And it's possible to have even more expansive forms of socialism managed through democratic governance. Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Norway provide good examples. They all have democratic governments and free markets, but they also have high tax rates that fund expansive public systems that benefit everyone, with things like free college, free healthcare, free internet access, and very advanced public infrastructures. That sounds not so bad, right? Okay, let's talk about Marxist theory of subject formation through material relations. In philosophical discourse, the word subject refers to that which is aware of itself as a perceiving and thinking self, separate from the objects that it perceives and reflects upon. It's the thing that each of us refers to as I or me. Now, an infant has no awareness of itself as a perceiving and thinking self that is separate from the objects that it perceives. Its whole experience is a kind of unorganized jumble that it navigates purely by instinct. But as it interacts with the world around it, the infant begins to distinguish between different objects and understand itself as the subject that perceives and thinks about those objects. And this process of subject formation continues throughout its entire life. Now, in humanist frameworks, the process of subject formation is understood to be pretty much the same for everyone. But within post-humanist frameworks, the processes of subject formation are generally understood to be shaped by the social environment that one inhabits. And in Marxist theory, that social environment takes shapes around what Marx called the relations of production, the ways in which a given society organizes the labor necessary for that society to exist. To get a better understanding of what this means, we need to start with Marx's labor theory of value. Consider an apple growing on a tree. The apple has potential value while it's on the tree because it can provide valuable nutrition to someone. But it has no actual value until some type of labor is performed on it. At the very least, it needs to be picked. In most cases, it also needs to be transported and distributed. If labor is not performed, the apple will simply fall on the ground and rot, and its potential value will never become actual value. So, while things like apple have potential value, actual value comes only from labor. Now, if you were to just pick an apple and eat it, you will have performed a certain amount of labor and then enjoyed for yourself the full value produced by that labor. But you can't survive just by picking and eating apples, and no one directly produces all the things they need to survive. So in any society, there's a basic organizing principle by which the value produced by someone's labor is distributed to other people. In Marxist theory, this organizing principle is called the relations of production. Now, different societies in different times and places have relied on very different relations of production. In many indigenous communal societies, for instance, labor is distributed among all members of the community according to things like gender, age, and status. Women might manage crops and gather wild produce, while men do things like hunt and build structures. Then the value produced by everyone's labor is shared more or less equally. In the feudal monarchies of the medieval period, everything within the realm technically belonged to a king who gave authority over certain areas to noblemen who pledged their loyalty to the crown and also agreed to surrender some percentage of the land's produce to the realm. These high-ranking noblemen would then divide their holdings among lower-ranking nobility who pledged loyalty to them, and so on down the line to the peasants who actually worked in the fields and performed other types of labor. In slave-holding societies, most labor is performed by slaves who are owned and managed by a master class. And within capitalist societies, resources are generally owned by a capitalist class that pays wages to a working class to perform the labor that produces value. We'll talk more about this later. So, these are just a few examples of the different ways in which societies have organized labor and the distribution of the value that it produces. Different relations of production. And if you think about it, each society has different natural resources to draw from, different plants, animals, and minerals in its environment, as well as different types of tools and technologies for gathering and processing those resources. Marx called these things the means of production. So the apple tree and any tools or technologies used to grow it or pick apples from it are part of the means of production. So every society has its own particular means of production and its own particular relations of production. And together, the means of production and relations of production make up what Marx called the base of the society. Now, Marx called this the base because he believed that all other components of the society take shape around it, around the basic means of production and the basic relations of production. In other words, In any given society, the base, whatever that looks like, determines what the rest of the society looks like. Its literature and art, its religion, its educational practices, its political and social arrangements, its family structures, its music and folklore, its traditions and values. And this list could go on because it includes everything about the society that is not part of the base. Marx called all of this the superstructure. Super just means above, so the superstructure is all the components of a society that lay on top of the base and take their shape from the base. Now, this has a couple of really important implications. One is that a different base gives you a different superstructure. So in each of these different types of societies with different means of production and different relations of production, the superstructure is going to look very different. Different types of stories will be told, children will be taught in different ways, religions and beliefs will be different, marriage and parenthood would work differently, and so on. And all of these differences stem from the fact that there's a different organization of labor. The second important implication is that you can't really make any significant changes to the superstructure without changing the base. You might be able to tinker around and make some minor changes to the political system, the educational system, the healthcare system, race relations, etc., but you can't really make substantial changes without making a radical change to the base, because all of those things take their shape from the base. This is why so much of Marxist politics revolves around the idea of revolution. For a true Marxist, tinkering around with the superstructure is pointless because significant change can only come from a revolution that transforms the base. Okay, let's get back to the idea of subject formation, because this is where Marxist theory gets really post-humanist. Marx pointed out that historically, most bases have been imbalanced and exploitive, meaning that one group performs the bulk of the labor that produces value, but enjoys only a relatively small portion of the value that is produced, while another group enjoys a relatively large portion of the value while performing only a small portion of the labor that produced it. So how is it that this can be maintained? Why does the exploited class, which is usually much larger than the class of exploiters, settle for such an arrangement? The answer is that both the exploiters and the exploited suffer from false consciousness. Marx argued that subject formation takes place within the superstructure, or, in other words, that the individual is shaped by its experiences within the superstructure. Everything about us, our ideas and beliefs, our values, our habits and attitudes, our tastes and preferences, all of these things take shape through our social experience within the superstructure. And here's the thing. The superstructure is designed to give us a false understanding of the base and to accept it as natural and good even when we're the ones who are exploited within it. In other words, the superstructure, our religious institutions, our educational institutions, our political systems and discourses, our media, everything around us is like a veil or a cloud that prevents us from seeing the true nature of the base and its fundamental injustice and cruelty. So the people who are responsible for exploiting others are often convinced that they are actually doing good and helping people, and that any inequalities or cruelties within the system are just necessary evils that need to be endured for the greater good. And the people who are exploited often don't recognize that they're being exploited, or they are convinced that any hardships they face are either natural or necessary, or due to their own shortcomings, or maybe even due to the evils of other exploited people who, say, look different from them, have different religious beliefs, or come from different places. In other words, even when they do see themselves as mistreated, they are often taught by the superstructure to place the blame in the wrong place. Okay, let's talk about how all of this applies to Marx's critique of capitalism. Let's go back to that apple on the tree in Marx's labor theory of value. So again, the apple on the tree has no actual value until some type of labor is performed on it. Now, if you pick the apple and eat it yourself, you enjoy the full value that your labor has produced. But you can't survive on apples alone, so you need a way to exchange that value for other types of value. If you lived in an indigenous communal society where the apple tree belongs to the village as a whole and you're responsible for picking apples, you would share the value you produce with others, and they in turn would share the value that they produce with their different labor. But if you live in a capitalist society, that apple tree would be privately owned, and probably not by you. It would be owned by someone else. Let's call him Joe. And Joe pays you a wage for the labor that you perform to give the apple its actual value. In this scenario, the apple tree is the means of production. And Joe, who owns the means of production, is the capitalist, and you're the labor. The wage that Joe pays you for your labor can be exchanged for the various types of value that you need to survive. So the engine that drives this type of capitalist system is surplus value. Imagine that this bar represents the total value of the apples that you pick in a typical day. The wage that you're paid for that labor is not actually equal to the value that your labor has produced. Let's say, for now, that it's 80% of that value. The remaining 20% is called surplus value, and that portion goes to Joe, the capitalist who owns the tree. Sounds pretty fair, right? So imagine that Joe owns a small orchard, and you're just one of his 4 employees. For every day of labor on the orchard, you receive 80% of the value produced by one person's day of labor. But since there are 4 workers, Joe also receives 80% of the value produced by one person's day of labor, since 4 times 20 is 80. But what if Joe has 6 people working on his orchard? Then he's receiving 120% of the value produced by one person's day of labor. So let's say that 80% portion is enough for you to get by and live a decent life. But Joe is making more than that. So guess what he's going to do with that extra? Maybe he'll just waste it away on little luxuries, and things will just remain as they are. But if he's a real capitalist, he'll buy more land and expand his orchard and employ more people. So let's say he does that, and now is able to employ 10 people on his orchard. This means that for every day of operation on the orchard, he's receiving 200% of the value produced by a single worker's labor. Now he's making even more money and can expand his orchard even more rapidly. Now let's imagine that Joe is not actually the nicest guy in the world, and you're not too happy working for him. You might be able to go find work on another orchard, right? But the bigger that Joe's operation gets, the bigger portion he has of the total apple market. In fact, he may even be buying out some of those other orchard owners who've been settling for small luxuries rather than expanding their operations. Well, this means that you have fewer options and may have to stick it out with Joe even though you don't like him that much. Now what if Joe decides that he's tired of paying workers 80% of the value that they produce and decides to pay them only 70%, so that he's now making 300% of the value produced by a single worker's labor, or more if he has more than 10 workers now? Well, some of his employees may be able to find jobs on other orchards where they can still get 80%. But because Joe has cornered so much of the apple market, their ability to do that will be limited. In other words, Joe's accumulation of surplus value gives him more and more power over the laborer, which means that he can extract more and more surplus value from them, creating a more and more exploitive relationship. And guess what? Joe is not just buying more land with all that surplus value, he's also buying the type of political and social influence that gives him even more power over the workers. Now, this is obviously a very oversimplified example, so let's look at a more concrete example. Tomatoes. Most of the tomatoes that we eat are grown in Florida, where they're picked by hand, as pictured here. So what percentage of the tomatoes' value do you think pickers like these earn in wages? 80%? 40%? 20%? Tomatoes sell for about $2 per pound, and the pickers make 50 cents, but not for every pound they pick, for every 32 pounds they pick. That's less than 2 cents per pound, or less than 1% of the value of the tomatoes. This means that a picker has to pick over 2 tons of tomatoes a day to earn the equivalent of a minimum wage. As a result, most of these workers earn less than $12,000 per year, which puts them well below the poverty line. They also tend to suffer from chronic health problems due to the difficulty of their labor and their daily exposure to chemical pesticides, but most of them lack adequate health care to deal with these problems. Now, most of these tomato pickers are aware that they're not being treated fairly, but they have few other choices for survival. And here we can talk about issues related to immigration in the U.S., but that's a whole other discussion. But the reality is that exploitation like this, maybe not to the same degree, but certainly of the same type, is rampant throughout our society, and most people are largely unaware of it, even when they are the victims. How does that happen? Remember that, according to Marx, exploitive systems like this are able to exist largely because of false consciousness. People's subjectivity, their selfhood, is structured through their experiences in a superstructure that gives them a flawed understanding of the base. So, historically, a big part of American culture is the idea of the American dream. The idea that if you work hard and be good, prosperity and good things will come your way. But think about the worker on Joe's orchard. The harder he works, the more Joe profits. And the more Joe profits, the more power he has to exploit the worker even further. That's kind of like the opposite of the American dream. Now, another big part of American culture is the celebration of a competitive ethos, or a competitive spirit, and the idea that the people who have wealth have earned it through their superior performance in some type of grand competition. This competitive ethos encourages those workers to actually identify with Joe and the other capitalists. Those are the guys who are the winners in the grand competition, the guys who have achieved the things that they themselves want to achieve. They understand Joe and the other capitalists as having earned their wealth, and they fantasize about achieving the same thing, not realizing that their own hard work only serves to further enrich Joe and the other capitalists. And those other workers around them? They don't identify with them as fellow victims of a large structure of exploitation. They see them as the competition. So, a Marxist theorist would understand these aspects of American culture, the competitive ethos and the idea of the American dream, as components of a superstructure that creates a false consciousness among American workers, preventing them from understanding how they're exploited within the capitalist base, the capitalist relations of production. So this brings us to the final main component of Marx's theory, which is his idea of historical development toward a socialist future. This theory is called historical materialism because it understands history as the product of basic material relations, which is to say that the history of any society is the history of its development of and transition between different base formations, different means and relations of production. Marx argued that all base formations, except socialism, feature relations of production that are fundamentally unequal. One class of people enjoys excess value, while another class of people perform a disproportionate amount of the labor. While false consciousness goes a long way towards preventing people from recognizing that inequality, or at least recognizing the injustice of such inequality, at some point the inequality becomes so severe that the people within the exploited class begin to identify with each other as suffering from a common victimhood within a large system designed to exploit them. They stop seeing themselves as in competition with each other and start seeing themselves as fellow members of an exploited class. They begin to develop a sense of solidarity with each other that Marx called class consciousness. And it's the antidote to false consciousness. Once exploited people start to develop class consciousness, they begin to understand the truth of the base formation in which they are exploited. This leads to class conflict, and ultimately to a revolution that transforms the base. In this way, each type of base formation creates the means of its own destruction. For example, Marxists generally explain that the feudal systems of medieval Europe depended partly on a merchant class that operated markets for the exchange of goods and services, but that the feudal system placed significant limitations on these markets. When these limitations became too burdensome, the merchant class rebelled, successfully dismantling the feudal economies and clearing the way for the emergence of capitalist economies. Marx saw the same type of process playing out with capitalism, where the exploitation of wage earners was becoming so severe that they were developing a class consciousness and would eventually succeed in carrying out a socialist revolution. According to Marx, however, the success of the socialist revolution would end this cycle of class conflict and revolution. This is because, in Marx's vision of a socialist society, the means of production are owned equally by everyone, so that there is no fundamental inequality built into the system, and therefore no basis for class conflict. Marx called this the end of history, because without class conflict, there would be no more radical changes to the structures of human societies. In other words, socialism would not produce its own demise. Well, I don't think we've reached the end of history, but we've definitely reached the end of this video. In just a moment, you should see in-video links to other Hilliard at Home videos, and you can also find links to other videos and e-courses. You should also check e-courses for any quizzes, assignments, or discussion boards related to this video. Thanks for watching.